of straight streets spill down the hill towards the river. Two of them are still unusually wide for so small a town. Mill Street, with its fine brickwork, is handsome. Broad Street is unforgettable. And though they look Georgian today, there seems little doubt that in the Middle Ages these two streets were just as wide as they are now. The cobbled inclines, with their nice knobbly texture, are a special feature here. They were valiantly fought for and saved a few years ago when it was proposed to remove them. Further down towards the river, the gradient used to be precipitous, but Thomas Telford, who was the county surveyor for his native Shropshire, eased it by making an embankment. At the bottom of the hill is Ludford Bridge. With its big, bold cutwaters, it dates from the 15th century. Ludlow's other two bridges are Georgian. Corve Bridge, about 1789, and Dinham Bridge, 1823. But before Ludlow's rivers were bridged, Roger de Lacy had chosen them as a good natural defence for his castle. Roger de Lacy also chose well because there was stone already on the site. He wanted a dry moat between the inner and the outer baileys. And here it is. This was achieved by hacking out the stone on the spot. This, to be geological just for a moment, is a rough, chunky, calcareous siltstone of the Silurian age. The castle is in fact a mixture of this Silurian stone and the old red sandstone brought probably from a mile or so away to the east. And as usual with old red sandstone, it isn't by any means always red. The moat was formerly crossed by a drawbridge, and beside it rears the keep, one of the earliest but still best preserved parts of the castle. There are three distinct periods here. The chapel, like the keep, is Norman. The chancel has gone, but the nave, apart from the roof, survives, and it is circular, which for England is something of a rarity. The doorway and the chancel arch are both richly ornamented with the characteristic Norman zigzag decoration. But the dates of the castle's buildings are most clearly revealed by the windows. The arrow slits in the Norman keep, the larger 14th century decorated windows of the Great Hall, and the more domestic-looking Elizabethan windows of the final stage of the castle's development. The castle, like the bridges, is built of stone, but there isn't much else here that is except the church, erected in the 14th and 15th centuries. Unlike the castle, which was built by the feudal lord, the church, the largest and proudest in Shropshire, was almost wholly the achievement of the townspeople. By the 15th century, Ludlow was approaching the zenith of its prosperity. There were guilds for many trades: mercers, drapers, shoemakers, millers, butchers, fishmongers, fletchers. They were the people who made the arrows. And above all, clothiers and wool merchants. It was primarily the profits of the wool trade which paid for this church. It was one of a good many in England at this time, which, as the old saying has it, were built on the backs of sheep. The tower, 135 feet high, is of old red sandstone, and so is the south porch. This, in the decorated style, is hexagonal, one of only two in England of this shape. This is the churchyard, not a grave to be seen. This will distress some people very much and will delight others, and it is indeed a very controversial question. The Georgian tombstones, with their finely cut lettering and sometimes scrolls and cherubic angels and so on, nearly always give great pleasure. And still better are their tomb chests. They use the local materials whenever they could. But round about 1850, a great change took place. Debased designs, often mass-produced, and also the introduction of screaming white and polished black marbles and fine granite and what's known as reconstituted stone, did appalling damage to the English churchyard. Other totally inappropriate materials appeared too. Those nauseating creme de menthe chips, particular bête noire of mine. All these stones did dreadful damage to the setting of many a fine church which had done absolutely nothing to deserve such treatment. Well, my view then would be that unless they qualify aesthetically, and very few of them do, one should record them and then remove them. And above all, don't allow any more. The clearing away of the gravestones is also historically correct, because until the 17th century there were none, only a churchyard cross, just as there is again today. Inside, we're in a big town church with a couple of really memorable features. The lovely wooden ceiling under the lantern tower of the 15th century, and the stalls, notable in possessing, for a parish church, an exceptionally fine set of misericords. Some of these misericords are real works of art in their own right. Crisply carved, uncrowded, decorative. Others, though always at Ludlow of a high accomplishment, are also of considerable social interest. This one, for example, a medieval kitchen, with the cook here on a low chair in front of the fire, and here an enormous kettle, and on this side a couple of pigs all ready for the spit. This one's a tapster. The only example of this subject on a misericord anywhere in the country. Here's a sexton, and on the right, the emblems of his trade: skulls, bones, spades. The term misericord derives from the Latin misericordia, meaning pity, and the objects of pity were elderly clergy. These carved brackets or ledges under the tip-up seats gave them support during long periods of standing at church services. The set also includes some heraldic illusions. The chained antelope, for instance, was the badge of King Henry VI. The falcon and the fetterlock, that of Richard, Duke of York. And finally, the Prince of Wales's feathers. Oak. What a wonderful wood it is. What a gift for the carvers. And not only in the church, but all over the town. Carved consoles or brackets, and patterns in profusion, both carved and, as is usual in the West Country, in the timber framing itself. They love diamond shapes, sometimes lozenge within lozenge. Some of these patterns are a little excessive. This one evokes nothing so much as a visit to the oculist. Broad Street displays today a great array of timber framing, and very popular it is without a doubt. But what is interesting is that the Georgians didn't really care for exposed timbers at all. So they covered them with plaster, and even as late as 1902 they looked like this. A welcome tendency of the last few years, here at Ludlow, as at Tewkesbury, has been to de-black the oak and reveal it again in its natural state, as here at the Reader's House, just to the east of the church. Black and white, as we saw at Tewkesbury, was a Victorian fashion. When old oak timbers, later plastered over, are revealed again, they will be found always to have preserved their natural colour. That's to say, light brown or grey-brown. The most memorable example of this new tendency is the Feathers Hotel. This building, although a good deal restored, dates from 1603 and displays West Country timber framing at its most exuberant. Anyone who remembers it from a few years ago, a sticky black all over, can hardly fail to be delighted by the change. The front door is original, with its 305 iron studs. Not hearsay, by the way, because as a matter of fact I counted them. It also has its original lock plate. The interior is no less decorative. This Jacobean chimney-piece is admittedly unsophisticated, but it certainly shows the continuing tradition of Ludlow's woodcarvers. Exactly the same spirit pervades the ceiling. It's chock-a-block with incident. But how these craftsmen must have enjoyed themselves. Towards the end of the 17th century, Ludlow for a while lost some of its former prosperity. Defoe wrote, "The town declineth. It was formerly a place of good trade." But happily the decline was only temporary, a fact to which the abundance of good Georgian houses bears ample witness. Most of them were built of brick, and there were several brick fields in the vicinity, one hardly more than a mile from the centre of the town. The appearance of the town was much altered and, in my view, improved during the 18th century. The new affluence was partly due to the arrival of another industry, glove-making. When, during the wars of Napoleon, French competition was removed, this did very well indeed. But Ludlow also became, in Georgian days, a fashionable social centre for the surrounding gentry, who, reluctant to make the long journeys to and from London, built town houses here. This was Lord Shrewsbury's house, dated on a rainwater head, 1728. This was the house of the Earl of Powys, who, by the way, still owns the castle. While this one, which I like the best, belonged to the Knight family of Downton Castle. Others, perhaps the houses of professional men or local merchants, although less grand, are equally pleasing. Architecturally, of course, these houses can be decidedly provincial. Look at this one. The so-called Venetian window, so difficult to find in Venice, was a favourite motif in Georgian England, often for a staircase or for the two-end rooms of a symmetrical elevation. But whoever would have thought of having Venetian windows and nothing else? 8 of them. It might be called over-egging the pudding, don't you think? '18th century house, perched with complete confidence upon the sole survivor of Ludlow's 6 13th century gatehouses. Window constructed as a dummy. The grey livery is recent, a most elegant addition to this marvellous street. Broad Street also has one of the very few houses in Ludlow, and a very handsome one it is, built of stone. It's the local, rather rough Silurian limestone, and it looks as if the surface at some time or other was scored in readiness for stucco, which happily was never applied. Within, the drawing-room has touches of Rococo elegance, typical of the middle of the 18th century. This is best seen at the fireplace, with its flowing fruit and leaf decoration based principally upon the acanthus. There are 2 staircases. This one dates from the 17th century, and survives from an earlier house on the site. Of the present Georgian house, a gracious feature is the main staircase. Like many others in Ludlow, this house has a walled garden at the back, and in the garden they erected an enchanting gazebo or summer house. It is finished with a wrought iron weather vane and battlements, and commands a view across the River Teme to the hills beyond. A weather vane is a feature too of another of Ludlow's few stone buildings, the Buttercross, built in 1743. It's classical with a touch of Baroque. The style is a little provincial perhaps, but it's a real ornament of the town. I do have friends who hold that I'm not absolutely, utterly and entirely fair about Victorian buildings. But they'd be hard put to it to find a good, even a bearable one here. Just look at these. Polychrome machine-made bricks in jazzy patterns, quite out of keeping here in Ludlow, on a building totally out of scale. Worse still is this one, with its particularly belligerent windows, its top-heavy dormers, and its hard, pasty-faced bricks. And the apotheosis of them all, the Market Hall of 1887, which Sir Nicholas Pevsner apostrophized with delicious aptitude as Ludlow's bad luck. It's pretentious, heavy-handed, and utterly gross in its so-called ornamentation. This is the hall which unhappily this detestable building replaced. The principal contribution of our own time is this: ceaseless traffic of a volume and size with which this town just can't cope. Thank goodness work has now started on the long-projected bypass. It can't be finished too quickly for the well-being of Ludlow. Yet, much survives. Here's the view at the top of Broad Street as Louise Rayner saw it about 1850. And here it is today. This is Samuel Scott's painting entitled Ludlow Looking North of about 1760. And here is Lower Broad Street in the 1840s. Ludlow, like all the 6 English towns that I've been talking about in these programs, is small enough to get to know intimately just by walking about. The only way, of course, of seeing a town properly. Here, as in all the others, we have a delightful mixture of building materials. We've seen impressive single buildings, like Chichester Cathedral or Tewkesbury Abbey, which, though centuries old, still belong to the present. And we have seen castles, like Richmond's, or this one here at Ludlow, which, except as tourist attractions, live now only in the past. But we also looked at a great many houses, a few grand ones, some humble, and the majority somewhere between the two. Now, what is the secret of the appeal of these buildings? It is surely that they all belong. They pay respect to what's called the genius loci, the spirit of the place. Local stone, wherever there was any. Bricks baked from the local clays. Oaks from the forests. No concrete at all. Because concrete, however useful structurally, doesn't belong. Wherever local materials were used, with a proper sense of scale, they look right. Not one of these 6 English towns is in any sense a museum. They're all working towns, and that's what's good to see. But in preparing these programs, one of the great pleasures was to meet in every one of them numbers of people with a tremendous concern for their towns. For there can be no surer guarantee that a fine old town will survive unspoiled than the corporate determination of its citizens that it shall.